Before the telephone became something ordinary in homes, offices, pockets, and hands, it was something far more astonishing, a human voice escaping distance. Long before mobile phones, before texting, before fiber optics and wireless networks, people lived with a hard and lonely truth. If someone was far away, their voice was gone. A letter could travel, a messenger could travel, news could travel. But the living sound of a person, their urgency, their laughter, their fear, their love could not. And when the telephone finally arrived, it changed more than communication. It changed waiting, absence, work, business, family, and the emotional shape of distance itself. Because the history of the telephone is not only the story of wires and circuits. It is the story of how human beings learned to let the voice travel farther than the body. Before the telephone, distance had a different kind of silence. That is where the real story begins. For most of human history, if you wanted to speak to someone, you had to stand near them. If they were in another town, another city, another country, then your words had to become something else before they could travel. They had to become ink on paper, messages carried by horse, signals sent by telegraph, or news delivered too late to feel alive. Communication existed, of course, but voice did not. The human voice was trapped inside the limits of presence, and that made separation feel heavier than it does now. A mother could wait weeks for news. A business decision could be delayed by days. An emergency could outrun the speed of help. Love had to survive on letters. Grief often arrived after the moment it might have changed something. That is what makes the telephone such a deeply human invention. It did not only speed up information, it restored immediacy to distance. It gave absence a new kind of nearness. But the telephone did not appear out of nowhere. It grew from an older dream, the dream of sending sound. By the 19th century, the telegraph had already changed communication by allowing coded messages to travel rapidly over wires. That alone was revolutionary. But the telegraph still required translation. Human feeling had to be reduced to symbols, then decoded again at the other end. Inventors wanted something greater. They wanted sound itself to move. They wanted the voice to cross distance without losing its living shape. According to Britannica, the telephone developed out of efforts to improve the telegraph, and its earliest history is bound up with that larger search for electrical communication. Then came one of the most famous moments in the history of technology. In 1876, Alexander Graham Bell received a patent for the telephone, and on March 10 of that year, Bell and his assistant Thomas Watson successfully transmitted an intelligible spoken message. "Mr. Watson, come here. I want to see you." The Smithsonian and the Library of Congress both preserved this moment as the first successful telephone message, while the Library of Congress also notes that Bell is credited with the invention because his patent and demonstrations were successful. That was the first great transformation. Human speech stopped belonging only to the room. It began belonging to the wire. And that may be one of the most emotional turning points in modern history. A voice could now leave the body and still remain a voice. Not a letter, not a code, not a summary. A voice. Hesitation could travel. Urgency could travel. Tone could travel. The telephone did not just send information, it sent presence. But the early telephone was still fragile, limited, and incomplete. Britannica notes that Bell's early telephone work was followed by important improvements in transmitters and systems, especially because the first telephone instruments had serious practical limits. Early devices could prove the principle, but they were not yet enough to support a truly large communication world. A great invention is rarely finished at birth. First it proves itself, then it spends decades becoming useful, and once the telephone became useful, history moved quickly. Because one telephone alone changes almost nothing. A network changes everything. That is the part many people overlook. The telephone's true power did not lie only in the invention of a handset. It lay in the building of connections between many users. Exchanges, switchboards, local lines, long-distance systems, these turned the telephone from an extraordinary object into a social system. Britannica's history of the telephone places heavy emphasis on the development of the public switched telephone network, and that is exactly where the invention became civilization-changing. A single voice traveling over a wire is amazing. Millions of people reachable through a network is a new world, and that network did something profound to daily life. It changed the meaning of waiting. Before the telephone, action was often delayed by communication itself. You wrote, you sent, you waited, you hoped. With the telephone, many kinds of waiting became shorter. Businesses could negotiate in real time. Doctors could be summoned more quickly. Families could send urgent news without delay. Cities could function with new speed. The telephone made coordination feel alive. It did not eliminate distance, but it wounded distance. It made faraway people interruptible. That may not sound dramatic today, but at the time, it must have felt astonishing. And maybe that is the hidden twist in telephone history. The telephone did not really shrink space. It shrank helplessness. If a loved one was sick, you could call. If a shipment was late, you could call. If a train changed, if a meeting moved, if danger appeared, if longing became unbearable, you could call. The telephone gave human beings a new response to uncertainty. It made action possible sooner. But like many inventions, the telephone did not spread into a neutral world. It entered business, status, and inequality. At first, telephones were expensive, limited, and unevenly available. Access depended on wealth, geography, infrastructure, and national development. Urban areas often gained service sooner than rural ones. Businesses had stronger reasons to install lines early. Governments and institutions understood quickly that communication meant power. In other words, the telephone was never only personal. It was also political and economic. Whoever could communicate faster, could organize faster, sell faster, govern faster, and respond faster. Then came another crucial chapter, the switchboard and the operator. In the early era of telephony, calls often had to be manually connected. That meant the voice did not move directly from one person to another without human help. It passed through a system and often through an operator. This created one of the most fascinating human layers in the story of the telephone. The network was technical, but also social. Telephone operators became the unseen bridge between strangers, businesses, households, and emergencies. The system could not yet function without people physically helping voices find their destination. And that means the telephone was never just a machine. It was also labor. The voices reaching each other were supported by wires, poles, switchboards, maintenance crews, reception staff, and operators who helped turn invention into routine. That is often how technological history really works. A magical device enters the world, but it becomes ordinary only because countless people support it from behind the scenes. As the 20th century unfolded, the telephone moved deeper into ordinary life. Homes gained telephones, offices depended on them, long-distance calling expanded. Automatic exchanges gradually replaced more manual systems. The telephone became less of a spectacle and more of an expectation. According to Britannica, the broader telephone system evolved into a vast public switched network, making voice communication part of everyday life rather than a rare event. That was another great transformation. The telephone became ordinary, and that may have been its greatest triumph. To become ordinary is not to become small. It is to become woven into life so completely that people forget how impossible it once seemed. The ringing telephone became part of the emotional architecture of the modern world. It interrupted dinners. It brought job offers. It delivered bad news. It saved time. It created urgency. It created anxiety. It connected lonely people. It frightened people at midnight. It made family voices travel into kitchens and hallways and bedrooms. And maybe that is why the telephone feels so emotional in memory. Because it did not only carry speech, it carried moments. A first call from a distant city, a parent checking in, a long-distance romance, a business deal, a hospital update, a teenager waiting by the phone, a payphone goodbye, a late-night confession, a wrong number that became a story. The telephone did not simply transmit sound, it transmitted turning points. For many generations, some of life's most important seconds arrived through a ringing device. Then the telephone changed again. It left the wall. That shift from fixed telephones to mobile phones may be one of the most important emotional changes in the history of communication. A house phone made the voice reachable at a place. A mobile phone made the voice reachable through a person. Time and movement changed again. Suddenly, communication no longer had to wait for someone to be home, at work, or beside a booth. The body and the voice were reunited across distance in a new way. And then, of course, the telephone became something even broader. It became the smartphone. At that point, the device was no longer only a voice machine. It was a camera, a map, a message center, a calendar, a library, a wallet, a news source, and a social portal. Yet even after all those changes, the deepest human logic of the telephone remained intact. We still want to reach each other across absence. We still want presence without travel. We still want to hear, answer, check, comfort, warn, confess, and connect. That is why the telephone still matters, even in a world where it has changed shape so dramatically. Because beneath all the technology, the telephone answered one of the oldest human aches, the ache of being apart. So when you think about the telephone now, do not see only plastic, glass, wires, or screens. See Bell and Watson in 1876. See the first spoken message crossing a wire. See the switchboards and operators. See the early exchanges. See the home telephones in hallways and parlors. See the business lines, the long-distance calls, the payphones, the desk phones, the ringing kitchens, the midnight emergencies, the whispered conversations, and the first mobile phones turning reachability into a constant condition. See the long human effort to make the voice outrun the body. Because the history of the telephone is, in the end, not just the history of communication. It is the story of how human beings learned to send their presence ahead of themselves. And maybe that is why the telephone changed the world so deeply. Not because it carried sound, but because it made distance feel less absolute. If you stayed until the end, then maybe the telephone no longer feels like just another device to you. Maybe it feels more like memory, urgency, comfort, absence, or one of those inventions that quietly changed what it means to miss someone. So I'd love to hear from you. When you think about the telephone, what does it mean to you most? Connection, nostalgia, family, speed, or something deeper? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell for more storytelling videos about the ordinary inventions and quiet technologies that changed human history.